The year is 1519, and in a small manor house in the Loire Valley of France, an old man lies dying. His hands, once capable of creating masterpieces that would outlast empires, now tremble as they rest upon the covers. Around his bed gather nobles and servants, all waiting for the final breath of perhaps the most extraordinary mind that has ever lived. This is Leonardo da Vinci, and his death will mark the end of an era that historians will call the Renaissance. But to understand why this single man's passing feels like the closing of an entire age, we must travel back to his beginning, to a world where genius was about to collide with opportunity in the most spectacular way imaginable. Before we dive into this incredible journey through one of history's most fascinating lives, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support means everything to me, and I'm genuinely curious where in the world you're joining me from today. Drop a comment and let me know. Now settle in as we explore the complete life of a man who refused to accept the limitations that others placed on human potential. Leonardo da Vinci was born on April 15th, 1452, in the small Tuscan hill town of Vinci, nestled in the rolling countryside west of Florence. The Italy of his birth was not the unified nation we know today, but a patchwork of city-states, duchies, and papal territories, each vying for power, influence, and survival. It was a world in transition, where medieval certainties were crumbling and new possibilities were emerging from the ruins of the old order. His birth itself tells us something crucial about the man he would become. Leonardo was what polite society called a natural son, the illegitimate child of Ser Piero da Vinci, a successful notary, and Caterina, a young peasant woman whose full name has been lost to history. In an age when legitimacy determined everything from inheritance rights to social standing, Leonardo entered the world already marked as different, already outside the conventional boundaries that defined most lives. Ser Piero was a man of standing in Vinci, part of a family that had served as notaries for generations. Notaries were the backbone of Italian commerce and law, men who drew up contracts, witnessed agreements, and kept the elaborate records that made trade and governance possible. They occupied a respectable middle position in society, neither noble nor common, but essential to the functioning of their world. Caterina, on the other hand, remains largely a mystery. Some historians suggest she may have been a slave from the East, others that she was simply a local girl. What we know for certain is that she gave birth to Leonardo and then disappeared from his story, married off to someone else, while the boy was raised in his father's household. This early separation from his mother would mark Leonardo throughout his life. He grew up surrounded by his father's family, but always aware that he was different, that the normal paths of inheritance and profession were closed to him. As an illegitimate son, he could not follow his father into the notarial profession, could not inherit the family business, could not even expect the same treatment as legitimate children who might come later. Instead of crushing his spirit, this limitation seems to have freed him to pursue paths that others might never have considered. The Vinci of Leonardo's childhood was a place where the natural world pressed close against human habitation. The town sat among olive groves and vineyards, with the Arno River valley stretching away toward Florence. This was a landscape that invited observation, where a curious child could study the flight of birds, the flow of water, the growth of plants, and the behavior of animals. Years later, Leonardo would fill thousands of pages with drawings and observations of the natural world, but the foundation for that scientific curiosity was laid in these early years among the hills of Tuscany. As a child, Leonardo displayed the kind of restless intelligence that both delights and exhausts adults. He asked endless questions, drew constantly, and showed an uncanny ability to see patterns and connections that escaped others. His grandfather, Antonio, kept detailed records of the family and in these ledgers we catch glimpses of a boy who was clearly extraordinary. There are notes about Leonardo's education, his fascination with mathematics, and his habit of filling every available surface with sketches and diagrams. But it was not just intellectual curiosity that set Leonardo apart. He possessed what his contemporaries called bellezza, a physical beauty that was almost otherworldly. Contemporary accounts describe him as tall and graceful, with flowing hair and penetrating eyes, a man whose very presence commanded attention. This combination of intellectual brilliance and physical magnetism would open doors throughout his life, drawing the attention of patrons and protectors who might otherwise have overlooked a bastard from a small town. By the time Leonardo reached adolescence, it was clear that conventional education had little to offer him. His father, Ser Piero, faced a decision that would shape not just his son's future, but the entire course of Western art and science. The boy could not become a notary, could not inherit the family business, but he possessed talents that might be channeled in other directions. In the 1460s, Florence was experiencing an unprecedented flowering of artistic achievement, and skilled craftsmen were in high demand. After careful consideration, Ser Piero made a choice that would change history. He would apprentice his son to one of Florence's most successful workshops. The master he chose was Andrea del Verrocchio, whose bottega, or workshop, was among the most prestigious in Florence. Verrocchio was not just a painter, but a complete artist craftsman who worked in bronze, marble, gold and silver. His workshop produced everything from massive public sculptures to delicate religious paintings, from elaborate festival decorations to practical engineering projects. It was in essence a Renaissance version of a research and development laboratory, where artistic vision met technical expertise to create works that seemed to transcend the merely human. When Leonardo arrived at Verrocchio's workshop around 1466, at the age of 14, he entered a world that would shape him in ways that went far beyond artistic technique. The bottega system was not like modern art schools, where students study theory before practice. Instead, apprentices learned by doing, starting with the most basic tasks and gradually working their way up to positions of greater responsibility. They ground pigments, prepared wooden panels, transferred drawings, and slowly, if they showed promise, were allowed to contribute to actual commissions. The workshop buzzed with activity from dawn to dusk. Multiple projects proceeded simultaneously, with different groups of workers specializing in different aspects of the creative process. A single painting might involve one person preparing the surface, another transferring the initial drawing, a third laying in the basic colors, and finally, the master himself adding the finishing touches that would transform craft into art. It was a collaborative process, but one that demanded the highest standards from every participant. Leonardo's fellow apprentices included some of the most talented young men in Florence. Among them was Sandro Botticelli, who would go on to create some of the most beloved paintings in Western art. There was also Pietro Perugino, who would later teach Raphael. The level of talent concentrated in this single workshop was extraordinary, a testament to Verrocchio's reputation and the creative energy of Florence during this period. But even among these gifted young men, Leonardo stood out. His technical skills developed with astonishing speed, but more importantly, he brought a different kind of intelligence to the work. Where others might copy what they saw, Leonardo questioned why things appeared as they did. He dissected the mechanics of vision, studied the behavior of light, and began to develop theories about how art could more perfectly capture the reality of the natural world. Verrocchio himself was quick to recognize Leonardo's exceptional abilities. The master began giving his young apprentice increasingly important responsibilities, allowing him to work on significant portions of major commissions. This was unusual, as most apprentices spent years on menial tasks before being trusted with anything that would be seen by the public. But Leonardo's talent was too obvious to waste on grinding pigments and cleaning brushes. The turning point came with a commission for the Baptism of Christ, intended for the monastery of San Salvi. Verrocchio designed the composition and painted most of the figures, but he allowed Leonardo to contribute an angel in the lower left corner of the painting. When the work was completed, that single angel revealed a level of artistic achievement that surpassed even the master's own work. The figure possessed a grace, a psychological depth, and a technical perfection that announced the arrival of a new kind of artist. Legend has it that when Verrocchio saw what his apprentice had accomplished, he put down his brushes and never painted again, recognizing that he had been surpassed by his student. While this story is probably apocryphal, it captures something true about the relationship between master and pupil. Leonardo was not simply learning Verrocchio's techniques, he was transcending them, developing approaches to art that would revolutionize painting for centuries to come. By 1472, at the age of 20, Leonardo had been accepted into the Painters' Guild of Florence, the Compagnia di San Luca. This was a significant achievement, marking his transition from apprentice to independent master. He was now qualified to take commissions, establish his own workshop, and train apprentices of his own. Most young artists at this stage would have set up shop and begun the steady work of building a reputation and a clientele. Leonardo, however, was already showing signs of the restless genius that would define his entire career. He seemed incapable of viewing art as simply a profession to be mastered and exploited. Instead, he saw it as a means of investigating the deepest mysteries of existence. His notebooks from this period, filled with observations about light, shadow, anatomy, and perspective, reveal a mind that refused to accept conventional boundaries between different fields of knowledge. The Florence of Leonardo's youth was the perfect environment for such intellectual ambition. Under the patronage of the Medici family, the city had become the epicenter of humanist learning, where scholars were rediscovering ancient Greek and Roman texts and attempting to synthesize classical wisdom with Christian theology. Artists were no longer seen as mere craftsmen, but as intellectual figures capable of contributing to humanity's understanding of itself and the world. This transformation in the status of artists created new opportunities, but also new pressures. Patrons expected not just technical skill, but evidence of learning, creativity, and intellectual sophistication. Artists were competing not just with each other, but with poets, philosophers, and scientists for the attention and support of wealthy and powerful sponsors. In this environment, Leonardo's combination of artistic genius and scientific curiosity made him uniquely valuable. Yet even as he established himself as one of Florence's most promising young artists, Leonardo was already displaying the characteristics that would both elevate and complicate his career. He had an almost compulsive need to understand how things worked, leading him to spend enormous amounts of time on research and experimentation that had no immediate practical application. He struggled to complete projects, often abandoning paintings when they no longer held his interest or when new challenges captured his attention. These tendencies were already visible in his earliest independent works. The Annunciation, painted around 1472 to 1475, shows his mastery of perspective and his careful observation of natural details, but it also reveals an artist more interested in solving technical problems than in simply creating beautiful objects. Every element of the painting seems to have been approached as a separate challenge to be overcome through study and experimentation. As Leonardo moved through his 20s, his reputation in Florence continued to grow, but so did his reputation for eccentricity and unreliability. Patrons wanted his genius, but they also wanted finished works delivered on schedule. Leonardo wanted to push the boundaries of what art could achieve, to use painting as a means of scientific investigation and philosophical reflection. These conflicting desires would create a pattern that would repeat throughout his life, leading to some of the greatest masterpieces ever created, but also to a string of abandoned projects and frustrated patrons. The stage was set for a career unlike any other in the history of art, a journey that would take Leonardo from the workshops of Florence to the courts of Milan, France and Rome, always searching for the perfect synthesis of art, science and human understanding that seemed to hover just beyond his grasp. The year 1476 would prove to be a watershed moment in Leonardo's young life, though not for reasons anyone might have expected. Florence, for all its artistic brilliance and intellectual ferment, was also a city where reputation could be destroyed overnight by whispered accusations and political machinations. It was in this atmosphere of creativity and paranoia that Leonardo found himself facing charges that would have ended most careers before they had truly begun. The accusation was sodomy, a crime that carried severe penalties in Renaissance Florence, including public humiliation, heavy fines, and even exile or death. An anonymous denunciation had been dropped into one of the tamburi, the wooden boxes placed throughout the city where citizens could report suspected crimes without revealing their identities. Along with Leonardo, several other young men were named, including members of prominent Florentine families. The charges were almost certainly politically motivated, part of the complex web of rivalries and vendettas that characterized Florentine society. For months, Leonardo lived under this shadow, his career and reputation hanging in the balance. The legal proceedings dragged on with agonizing slowness, and during this time, he found it difficult to secure new commissions or maintain his position in Florentine society. The experience marked him profoundly, instilling a wariness of public exposure and a preference for the protection of powerful patrons that would characterize the rest of his life. Eventually, the charges were dropped for lack of evidence, but the damage to Leonardo's sense of security was permanent. He became more guarded, more careful about his associations, and more dependent on the goodwill of those who could shield him from his enemies. This crisis also deepened his natural tendency towards secrecy and coded communication, leading him to develop the mirror writing that would make his notebooks so difficult for others to read. The aftermath of this ordeal coincided with a shift in Leonardo's artistic development that would establish him as one of the most innovative painters of his generation. Around 1478, he received a commission that would become one of his most important early works, the Adoration of the Magi for the monastery of San Donato a Scopeto. This painting, though never completed, reveals the full emergence of Leonardo's revolutionary approach to composition and psychological depth. Where traditional treatments of this subject arranged figures in static, hierarchical compositions, Leonardo created a dynamic spiral of movement that drew the viewer's eye inexorably toward the central figures of Mary and the infant Christ. Every gesture, every expression, every detail of costume and setting was calculated to contribute to the overall emotional impact of the scene. The painting was conceived not just as a religious image, but as a psychological drama that would engage viewers on multiple levels. The preparatory drawings for the Adoration reveal the extraordinary depth of Leonardo's research and planning. He studied horses in motion to perfect the rearing steeds in the background, analysed facial expressions to capture the range of human responses to divine revelation, and explored architectural elements that would create the proper sense of space and grandeur. Each aspect of the painting became an opportunity for scientific investigation and artistic innovation, but as with so many of Leonardo's projects, the Adoration was destined to remain unfinished. As he worked on the complex composition, new challenges and opportunities began to pull his attention in different directions. His notebooks from this period reveal a mind that was expanding beyond the boundaries of painting to encompass engineering, anatomy, mathematics, and natural philosophy. He was becoming less a painter who dabbled in other subjects, and more a universal genius for whom painting was just one means of understanding the world. This intellectual restlessness was both Leonardo's greatest strength and his most serious weakness. While other artists focused on perfecting their craft within established traditions, Leonardo was constantly pushing into uncharted territory, developing new techniques and asking questions that had never been asked before. The results were often breathtaking, but the process was slow, expensive, and frequently frustrating for patrons who simply wanted finished works. The political situation in Florence during the late 1470s and early 1480s also created an atmosphere that was increasingly uncomfortable for someone of Leonardo's temperament. The Pazzi conspiracy of 1478, in which members of a rival banking family attempted to assassinate Lorenzo de' Medici during Mass at the cathedral, had left the city on edge. The failed plot resulted in brutal reprisals, with conspirators hanged from the windows of the Palazzo della Signoria and their supporters hunted down throughout the city. Leonardo witnessed firsthand the savage realities of Florentine politics when he was commissioned to paint portraits of the executed conspirators on the exterior walls of the Bargello prison. These images, designed to serve as warnings to future plotters, required him to study the faces of dead men and capture their likenesses in a way that would both identify them and demonstrate the consequences of treason. The work was macabre, but it also provided Leonardo with opportunities to study human anatomy and facial structure that would prove invaluable in his later artistic development. The experience of painting the dead conspirators seems to have crystallized Leonardo's growing disenchantment with Florence. The city that had nurtured his genius was also a place of violence, suspicion, and petty rivalries that increasingly seemed to constrain rather than inspire his work. He began to look beyond the walls of Florence, imagining possibilities that might exist in other courts, other cities, other centers of power and learning. It was during this period of restlessness and searching that Leonardo began to develop the persona that would define his later career. He cultivated an image of himself as more than just an artist, presenting himself as a master of multiple disciplines who could serve patrons not just as a painter, but as an engineer, inventor, military advisor, and court entertainer. This was a radical departure from traditional artistic practice, where painters were expected to remain within clearly defined professional boundaries. The transformation of Leonardo from a talented young painter into a Renaissance polymath was gradual but decisive. His notebooks from the early 1480s show him grappling with problems of hydraulic engineering, studying the flight of birds, designing mechanical devices, and exploring mathematical principles that had applications far beyond the visual arts. He was creating for himself a new kind of professional identity, one that would allow him to pursue knowledge wherever it might lead. This evolution was perfectly timed to coincide with changes in how Renaissance courts operated and what they expected from the artists and intellectuals they supported. The old model, in which painters were essentially skilled craftsmen who worked on specific commissions, was giving way to a new system in which artists were valued as much for their intellectual capabilities as for their technical skills. Courts wanted figures who could enhance their prestige through their very presence, men whose reputation for learning and creativity would reflect well on their patrons. Leonardo understood these changing dynamics better than most of his contemporaries, and he began to position himself accordingly. He studied not just art and engineering, but also music, literature, and natural philosophy, developing the kind of broad cultural knowledge that would make him a valuable addition to any sophisticated court. He also cultivated the personal qualities that would appeal to aristocratic patrons, developing an elegance of manner and conversation that matched his physical beauty and intellectual gifts. By 1482, Leonardo had made a decision that would shape the next phase of his career. Florence, for all its artistic achievements, was becoming too small for his expanding ambitions. The city's republican government, while supportive of the arts, could not offer the kind of sustained patronage that would allow him to pursue his most ambitious projects. What he needed was a powerful prince who could provide not just financial support, but also access to the resources and personnel necessary for large-scale engineering and artistic undertakings. His attention turned to Milan, one of the most powerful and wealthy city-states in northern Italy. The Duke of Milan, Ludovico Sforza, known as Il Moro, was building one of the most brilliant courts in Europe, attracting scholars, artists, and inventors from across the continent. Milan was also a centre of military innovation, constantly developing new weapons and fortifications to maintain its position in the complex web of Italian politics. For someone of Leonardo's interests and ambitions, it seemed like an ideal destination. The letter that Leonardo wrote to Ludovico Sforza, seeking employment at the Milanese court, reveals both his strategic intelligence and his understanding of what patrons really wanted. Rather than emphasizing his artistic achievements, he presented himself primarily as a military engineer, listing 10 different areas in which he could serve the Duke's military needs, from designing portable bridges to creating new types of siege weapons. Only at the end of the letter did he mention, almost as an afterthought, that he could also paint. This approach showed Leonardo's shrewd understanding of Renaissance political realities. While courts appreciated artistic beauty, what they needed most urgently were practical advantages in the constant struggle for survival and expansion that characterized Italian politics. By positioning himself as someone who could contribute to Ludovico's military capabilities, Leonardo was offering something far more valuable than mere decoration. The strategy worked. In 1482, at the age of 30, Leonardo left Florence for Milan, beginning a new chapter in his life that would see him develop from a promising young artist into one of the most celebrated figures of the Renaissance. The move represented more than just a change of residence. It was a transformation of identity, from a Florentine painter to an international genius whose reputation would eventually span continents and centuries. The Milan that Leonardo entered was a city in the midst of its own transformation. Under Ludovico Sforza's rule, it was becoming one of the most sophisticated and cosmopolitan courts in Europe, a place where intellectual curiosity was valued as highly as political skill or military prowess. It was exactly the environment that Leonardo needed to fully develop his extraordinary capabilities, and the results of this perfect match between genius and opportunity would astonish the world. The Milan of 1482 was unlike any city Leonardo had ever experienced. Where Florence hummed with the energy of merchants and bankers, Milan pulsed with the rhythm of absolute power. The Sforza court was a glittering machine designed to project strength and sophistication, and Leonardo found himself at the center of a world where artistic achievement served political ambition on a scale he had never imagined. Ludovico Sforza, known as Il Moro for his dark complexion and cunning nature, was not yet the official Duke of Milan. He ruled as regent for his young nephew Gian Galeazzo, but everyone understood that real power rested in his hands. Ludovico was a man of immense culture and equally immense ambition, determined to transform Milan into a rival to Florence and Venice, while securing his own position against the numerous enemies who questioned his right to rule. The court that welcomed Leonardo was a carefully orchestrated spectacle of wealth and learning. The Castello Sforzesco, the massive fortress that served as the ducal residence, had been transformed from a military stronghold into a palace of unprecedented luxury. Its halls were filled with the finest art, its libraries stocked with rare manuscripts, and its chambers designed to impress visiting dignitaries with the refinement and power of Milanese civilization. Leonardo's first years in Milan were a period of careful positioning and gradual recognition. Unlike Florence, where his reputation preceded him, Milan required him to prove his worth in an environment where competition was fierce, and failure could mean not just professional disappointment, but actual physical danger. The court was filled with ambitious men from across Europe, each seeking to advance their fortunes through service to Ludovico, and the struggle for patronage and position was constant. The artist quickly demonstrated his value through a series of smaller commissions that showcased his versatility and innovation. He designed sets for court entertainments, created portraits of court ladies, and began work on engineering projects that would enhance Milan's military capabilities. Each success brought him closer to the inner circle of power, and gradually, Ludovico began to recognize that he had acquired not just another talented artist, but a genius whose capabilities extended far beyond conventional categories. The commission that would truly establish Leonardo's reputation in Milan came in the form of an equestrian monument to Francesco Sforza, Ludovico's father and the founder of the Sforza dynasty. This was to be no ordinary statue, but a bronze colossus larger than any sculpture created since ancient times, a monument that would proclaim Milanese power and Sforza legitimacy to the world. The technical challenges involved in creating such a massive bronze casting were staggering, requiring innovations in metallurgy, engineering, and artistic technique that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible. Leonardo approached the project with characteristic thoroughness, filling notebook after notebook with studies of horses in motion, anatomical analyses, and engineering calculations. He studied the mechanics of equine movements with scientific precision, dissecting dead horses to understand the structure of muscles and bones, and observing living animals to capture the essence of power and grace that the monument would need to convey. The preparatory work was exhaustive, transforming what might have been a conventional commemorative sculpture into a groundbreaking investigation of art, science, and engineering. The scale of the project required Leonardo to master entirely new skills and develop novel techniques. The bronze required for the casting would weigh more than 70 tons, necessitating the construction of specialized furnaces and the development of new methods for controlling the flow of molten metal. The supporting structure had to be engineered with mathematical precision to prevent collapse, while the artistic conception demanded a level of dynamic movement that had never been attempted in sculpture of this size. As work on the horse progressed, Leonardo's reputation spread throughout Italy and beyond. The project became a symbol of Milanese ambition and technological superiority, with visitors travelling from across Europe to witness the creation of what promised to be the eighth wonder of the world. The clay model, when finally completed, stood nearly 24 feet high and was universally acclaimed as a masterpiece of both artistic vision and technical achievement. But the horse also revealed the limitations that would plague many of Leonardo's greatest projects. The sheer complexity of the undertaking meant that progress was slow and expensive, requiring sustained support from Ludovico over many years. As political pressures mounted and military threats intensified, the resources required for the bronze casting became increasingly difficult to justify. The 70 tons of bronze that had been allocated for the sculpture were eventually redirected to the more immediate need of manufacturing cannons for Milan's defence. The fate of the horse became symbolic of the precarious balance between artistic ambition and political reality that characterised Leonardo's entire career in Milan. While he enjoyed unprecedented freedom to pursue his interests and develop his ideas, he was also dependent on the continued favour of a patron whose own position was far from secure. The sophisticated court culture that nurtured his genius was built on foundations that could shift dramatically with changes in political fortune. During these same years, Leonardo was also pursuing the painting commissions that would establish his reputation as the greatest artist of his generation. The Virgin of the Rocks, painted for the Confraternity of the Immaculate Conception, revealed the full maturation of his revolutionary approach to painting. The work demonstrated his mastery of sfumato, the subtle gradation of tones and colours that created an almost magical sense of depth and atmosphere. The painting was unlike anything that had been seen before in Italian art, where traditional religious paintings relied on clear outlines and bright colours to convey their messages. Leonardo created a mysterious twilight world where forms emerged from shadow through almost imperceptible gradations of light and dark. The technique required an understanding of optics and atmospheric perspective that went far beyond conventional artistic training, representing a synthesis of scientific observation and artistic intuition that was uniquely his own. The psychological depth of the Virgin of the Rocks was equally revolutionary. Each figure was conceived not as a symbolic representation, but as a complex individual with their own interior life and emotional reality. The Virgin's protective gesture toward the infant Christ, the angel's knowing smile, and the young John the Baptist's gesture of recognition all contributed to a narrative that unfolded through subtle visual cues rather than obvious symbolic devices. This approach to painting as psychological drama would reach its ultimate expression in the work that many consider Leonardo's greatest achievement, The Last Supper. Commissioned for the refectory of the convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie, this fresco was intended to serve as a devotional image for the Dominican friars who gathered there for their meals. What Leonardo created instead was a revolutionary exploration of human psychology under extreme stress, a work that transformed a familiar religious subject into a timeless meditation on betrayal, loyalty, and the complexity of human nature. The technical innovations required for The Last Supper were as groundbreaking as its artistic conception. Traditional fresco technique required artists to work quickly while the plaster was still wet, making careful planning and detailed execution difficult. Leonardo instead developed an experimental technique that allowed him to work more slowly and deliberately, building up layers of paint with the precision and subtlety that his vision required. The composition itself was a masterpiece of mathematical precision and psychological insight. The 12 apostles were arranged in 4 groups of 3, each group representing a different emotional response to Christ's announcement that one of them would betray him. The perspective lines all converged on Christ's head, creating a visual focus that reinforced the narrative centrality of his announcement, while the varied reactions of the disciples revealed the full spectrum of human response to crisis and revelation. Every detail of the painting was calculated to contribute to its overall impact. The positioning of hands, the direction of gazes, the arrangement of drapery, and the placement of objects on the table all served to guide the viewer's attention and enhance the dramatic tension of the scene. The result was a work that functioned simultaneously as religious art, psychological drama, and technical tour de force, establishing Leonardo as the preeminent painter of his age. But even as Leonardo was creating these masterpieces, his restless intelligence was pulling him in new directions that would ultimately define his legacy as much as his artistic achievements. His notebooks from the Milan period reveal a mind that was systematically investigating every aspect of the natural world, from the flight of birds to the flow of water, from human anatomy to mechanical engineering, from optics to acoustics. The court of Ludovico Sforza provided the perfect environment for this intellectual expansion. Unlike the commercial workshops of Florence, where time was money and efficiency was paramount, the Milanese court valued learning for its own sake and was willing to support investigations that had no immediate practical application. Leonardo was able to pursue questions simply because they fascinated him, developing a body of scientific observation and theoretical speculation that would not be equaled for centuries. His anatomical studies during this period were particularly groundbreaking. Working with physicians at local hospitals, Leonardo performed dissections on human corpses, creating detailed drawings that revealed the structure and function of internal organs with unprecedented accuracy. These studies went far beyond the needs of artistic representation, representing genuine scientific research that advanced human understanding of physiology and anatomy. The mechanical inventions that filled his notebooks during these years were equally remarkable. Leonardo designed flying machines based on his observations of bird flight, military engines that could revolutionize siege warfare, and hydraulic systems that could transform agriculture and urban planning. While many of these designs were too advanced for the technology of his time, they demonstrated an understanding of mechanical principles that would not be fully appreciated until the modern era. This explosion of creative and intellectual activity established Leonardo as far more than just an artist in the eyes of his contemporaries. He became a symbol of human potential itself, a figure who seemed to embody the Renaissance belief that individual genius could transcend traditional limitations and achieve something approaching divine knowledge. The court of Milan, under his influence, became a centre of innovation and learning that attracted scholars and artists from across Europe. Yet even as Leonardo reached the height of his powers and influence, the political foundations of his success were beginning to crumble. The complex web of alliances that maintained the balance of power in Italy was shifting, and the French were beginning to cast covetous eyes on the wealthy Italian city-states. Ludovico Sforza, for all his cultural achievements and political cunning, was about to face challenges that would test not only his rule, but the entire world that had nurtured Leonardo's genius. The year 1499 would bring catastrophic change to Milan, and with it, the end of the most productive and stable period of Leonardo's career. The master who had seemed to find his perfect environment was about to discover that in the world of Renaissance politics, even genius offered no protection against the brutal realities of power and ambition. The golden age of the Milanese court was drawing to a close, and Leonardo would soon find himself once again in search of a patron who could provide both protection and the freedom to pursue the endless questions that drove his extraordinary mind. The storm that would destroy Leonardo's Milanese paradise had been gathering for years, but few at Ludovico's glittering court had paid attention to the dark clouds massing beyond the Alps. The French king, Charles VIII, had already demonstrated his appetite for Italian conquest during his invasion of 1494, and his successor, Louis XII, harboured even greater ambitions. When Louis ascended to the French throne in 1498, he immediately began pressing his claim to the Duchy of Milan, arguing that his grandmother's marriage to a Visconti duke gave him legitimate rights to the territory that Ludovico Sforza had usurped. For Leonardo, absorbed in his scientific investigations and artistic projects, the approaching crisis must have seemed like a distant thunder, ominous but not immediately threatening. He had spent 17 years building his reputation and position in Milan, creating a life that allowed him unprecedented freedom to pursue his diverse interests. The Sforza court had become not just his workplace, but his intellectual home, an environment where his restless curiosity was valued and supported rather than seen as an inconvenient distraction from more practical concerns. The signs of impending disaster were everywhere for those willing to see them. Ludovico's political manoeuvring had become increasingly desperate as he sought allies against the French threat, while simultaneously trying to maintain his precarious hold on power within Milan itself. His nephew, Gian Galeazzo, the rightful duke, had died under suspicious circumstances in 1494, allowing Ludovico to assume the ducal title officially, but this move had only intensified the questions about his legitimacy and created new enemies both within and outside the duchy. Leonardo's great bronze horse, that symbol of Milanese power and Sforza legitimacy, had become an increasingly painful reminder of unfulfilled promises. The clay model still stood in its workshop, a magnificent testament to artistic and engineering achievement, but the bronze that should have given it permanent form had long since been melted down for cannons. The horse had become a metaphor for the court itself, brilliant in conception, but ultimately vulnerable to the harsh realities of political and military necessity. The collapse, when it came, was swift and devastating. In September 1499, French forces crossed the Alps and advanced on Milan with an efficiency that shocked the Italian political establishment. Ludovico's carefully constructed alliances crumbled as former allies either fled or switched sides, leaving him isolated and defenceless. The Duke, who had once commanded one of the most powerful courts in Europe, found himself abandoned by all but his most loyal followers, facing an enemy whose military superiority was overwhelming. On October 6, 1499, King Louis XII entered Milan in triumph, ending nearly a century of Sforza rule. The magnificent court that had been Leonardo's world for 17 years simply ceased to exist overnight. Courtiers scattered to find new patrons, servants fled with whatever valuables they could carry, and the great palace that had been the centre of Milanese cultural life emptied as if struck by plague. Leonardo faced a crisis that went far beyond the loss of employment. At 47 years old, he was no longer a promising young artist who could easily find new opportunities. His reputation was enormous, but it was also complex and sometimes troubling to potential patrons. He was known as much for his unfinished projects as for his completed masterpieces and his scientific interests. While fascinating, often seemed to distract him from the practical tasks that rulers needed accomplished. The immediate danger was even more pressing than the long-term challenge of finding new patronage. The French occupation was accompanied by widespread looting and destruction, as soldiers and camp followers seized whatever they could find. Leonardo's workshop, filled with years of accumulated drawings, models, and experimental apparatus, was particularly vulnerable. The great clay model of the horse became a target for French archers, who used it for target practice until it was reduced to fragments, destroying forever one of the most ambitious artistic projects of the Renaissance. In the chaos of those final weeks in Milan, Leonardo managed to salvage what he could of his life's work. He gathered his most precious notebooks, rolled up his drawings, and prepared for another exile that would take him back into the uncertain world of seeking patronage and protection. The mathematical calculations, anatomical studies, and engineering designs that filled his notebooks represented decades of investigation and discovery, intellectual treasures that were irreplaceable and infinitely portable. The journey south from Milan in late 1499 must have been filled with uncertainty and regret. Leonardo was accompanied by his longtime companion Salai, a young man of dubious reputation but undeniable beauty who had entered his household as a boy and remained despite a talent for theft and mischief that had earned him his nickname, which meant Little Devil. Also travelling with them was Luca Pacioli, the brilliant mathematician whose work on proportion and geometry had deeply influenced Leonardo's thinking about art and science. Their destination was Venice, where Leonardo hoped to find temporary refuge and perhaps new opportunities. The Venetian Republic, with its vast commercial empire and tradition of hiring foreign experts for military and engineering projects, seemed like a logical place for someone of his talents to find employment. Venice was also one of the few Italian states with both the resources and the independence necessary to resist French expansion, making it a natural haven for refugees from French-occupied territories. The Venice that welcomed Leonardo in December 1499 was a city unlike any other in Europe, a maritime empire built on trade and maintained through a combination of diplomatic cunning and naval power. The Venetians had created a unique form of government that balanced aristocratic privilege with republican institutions, producing a stability that had endured for centuries, while other Italian states rose and fell with bewildering frequency. But Venice also presented Leonardo with challenges that he had not anticipated. The city's pragmatic merchant culture was less interested in pure intellectual speculation than the courtly environment he had left behind in Milan. Venetian patrons wanted results that could enhance their commercial or military advantages, and they were less willing to support the kind of open-ended research that had flourished under Ludovico's patronage. The commission that the Venetian Senate offered Leonardo reflected these practical priorities. They wanted him to design defensive systems that could protect their territories on the Italian mainland from the advancing French forces. This was exactly the kind of military engineering work that Leonardo had promised in his letter to Ludovico Sforza 20 years earlier, but the specific challenges posed by the Venetian situation required entirely new approaches to the problems of fortification and defence. Leonardo's response was characteristically innovative and ambitious. Rather than simply strengthening existing fortifications, he proposed a radical solution that would use the natural geography of the region to create an impregnable barrier against invasion. His plan called for the construction of a series of dams and canals that would allow the Venetians to flood the entire Isonzo Valley, creating an impassable water barrier between French forces and Venetian territory. The engineering challenges involved in such a project were staggering, requiring precise calculations about water flow, soil composition, and structural engineering that pushed the boundaries of contemporary knowledge. Leonardo threw himself into the work with characteristic intensity, producing detailed drawings and mathematical analyses that demonstrated both the feasibility and the potential effectiveness of his proposal. But even as he worked on these military projects, Leonardo's restless mind was exploring other possibilities that Venice might offer. The city's position as a centre of international trade meant that it was constantly exposed to new ideas and technologies from across the known world. The Venetian arsenal, where the Republic's mighty fleet was built and maintained, represented one of the most advanced centres of industrial production in Europe, a place where traditional craftsmanship was being transformed by new methods of organisation and mechanisation. Leonardo's notebooks from his Venetian period reveal his fascination with these industrial innovations. He studied the rope-making machines, the standardised production methods, and the coordinated workflow that allowed the arsenal to build ships with unprecedented speed and efficiency. These observations would later influence his thinking about mechanical design and industrial organisation, contributing to inventions and theories that were centuries ahead of their time. The scientific opportunities that Venice offered were equally compelling. The city's physicians and natural philosophers had access to medical knowledge from across the Mediterranean world, including translations of Arabic texts that preserved and extended ancient Greek learning. Leonardo's anatomical studies, which had been interrupted by his hasty departure from Milan, could be resumed with access to new sources of information and possibly new opportunities for dissection and observation. Yet despite these intellectual attractions, Leonardo's stay in Venice would prove to be brief and ultimately unsatisfying. The Republic's government, for all its stability and prosperity, operated according to procedures and priorities that left little room for the kind of individual genius that Leonardo represented. Decisions were made by committees, projects were evaluated according to immediate practical benefits, and the kind of long-term speculative research that Leonardo valued was difficult to justify within the Venetian system. The flooding project, despite its technical brilliance, was ultimately rejected by the Senate as too expensive and too risky. Venetian military engineers, while acknowledging the innovation of Leonardo's approach, were skeptical about its practicality and concerned about the potential for unintended consequences that could damage Venetian territories as much as they protected them. The Republic's traditional reliance on naval power and diplomatic maneuvering seemed more reliable than radical new schemes that might or might not work as intended. By the spring of 1500, Leonardo was already looking beyond Venice for new opportunities. Letters and rumours from across Italy brought news of potential patrons and promising situations that might offer the combination of financial support and intellectual freedom that he required. The French occupation of Milan had disrupted the entire Italian political system, creating both dangers and opportunities as various powers struggled to adapt to the new reality. One possibility that seemed particularly promising was a return to Florence, the city where Leonardo's career had begun nearly 30 years earlier. The Florentine Republic had recently undergone its own political transformation, overthrowing the Medici and establishing a new government that claimed to represent the will of the people. This republican regime was actively seeking to enhance its prestige and demonstrate its cultural sophistication by attracting prominent artists and intellectuals who could contribute to a new flowering of Florentine achievement. The prospect of returning home held both attractions and complications for Leonardo. Florence represented the roots of his artistic development and the place where he had first learned to see himself as more than just a craftsman. But it was also the city where he had faced legal troubles and social obstacles that had ultimately driven him to seek his fortune elsewhere. The question of whether the new Florentine government would welcome him warmly or view him with suspicion remained to be answered. As spring turned to summer in 1500, Leonardo made the decision to leave Venice and return to Florence, beginning another chapter in a life that seemed destined to be marked by constant movement and adaptation. The great artist who had once seemed to have found his perfect home in Milan was once again in search of a patron and a place where his extraordinary talents could flourish. The road ahead would lead through familiar territories, transformed by war and political upheaval, toward a city that promised both homecoming and new challenges in equal measure. The Florence that Leonardo entered in April 1500 was dramatically different from the city he had left 18 years earlier. The confident merchant republic of his youth had been replaced by a more austere and uncertain state, one that had experienced the trauma of foreign invasion, internal revolution, and religious upheaval. The magnificent court culture that had flourished under Lorenzo de' Medici was gone, replaced by a more sober republican government that viewed artistic luxury with suspicion while still recognizing the value of cultural prestige. The changes went far beyond politics to touch every aspect of Florentine life. The brief but intense influence of Girolamo Savonarola, the Dominican friar who had dominated the city during the 1490s, had left lasting marks on Florentine culture and consciousness. Savonarola's condemnation of worldly vanity and his calls for moral purification had led to the famous bonfires of the Vanities, where citizens had voluntarily destroyed paintings, books, cosmetics, and other objects deemed spiritually dangerous. Though Savonarola himself had been executed in 1498, his influence lingered in the form of a more austere public culture that was suspicious of the kind of courtly magnificence that had characterized the Medici era. The new Florentine government, led by the Republican politician Piero Soderini, was committed to democratic principles and civic virtue, but it also recognized that cultural achievement could enhance the Republic's reputation and attract the support of powerful allies. For Leonardo, this new Florence presented both opportunities and challenges that required careful navigation. His reputation as one of the greatest artists of the age preceded him, but so did his association with the kind of courtly culture that the Republic had rejected. The question of how to position himself within this transformed political and cultural landscape would require all of his considerable diplomatic skills and adaptability. The commission that would define Leonardo's second Florentine period came from an unexpected source. The Servite friars of the Annunciata, seeking a prestigious altarpiece for their church, had originally contracted with Filippino Lippi for a painting of the Virgin and Child with St. Anne. When they learned that Leonardo had returned to Florence, they approached him with an offer that he found impossible to refuse, not least because it came with housing and support for his entire household. Leonardo's response to this commission would demonstrate both his continued artistic evolution and his growing reputation as a figure whose very presence enhanced the prestige of his patrons. Rather than simply delivering a conventional religious painting, he created a cartoon, a full-scale preparatory drawing that became a sensation in its own right. The work depicted the Virgin Mary seated on the lap of her mother, St. Anne, with the infant Christ reaching toward a lamb held by the young John the Baptist. The psychological complexity and technical innovation of this cartoon were immediately recognized by contemporary viewers. The interweaving of the four figures created a composition of unprecedented dynamism and emotional depth, while Leonardo's mastery of sfumato created an almost supernatural sense of atmosphere and volume. When the cartoon was displayed publicly, it drew crowds of admirers who came not just to see a beautiful drawing, but to witness what seemed like a new form of artistic achievement. The public response to the St. Anne cartoon revealed something important about Leonardo's evolving reputation. He was no longer seen merely as a skilled painter or even as a court artist, but as a kind of cultural phenomenon whose work transcended conventional categories. People came to see his drawings and paintings the way they might visit a wonder of nature or a sacred relic, seeking an experience that went beyond aesthetic appreciation to approach something like spiritual revelation. This elevation of artistic status brought Leonardo new kinds of opportunities and responsibilities. The Florentine government, recognizing his value as a cultural ambassador, began to consider him for projects that would enhance the Republic's prestige and demonstrate its commitment to artistic excellence. The most ambitious of these projects would prove to be one of the greatest challenges of Leonardo's career, testing not only his artistic abilities, but also his capacity to work within the constraints of Republican politics and public accountability. The commission that would consume Leonardo's energies and challenge his reputation for the next several years came in the form of a direct challenge from the Florentine government. The Republic's new leaders, eager to demonstrate their cultural sophistication while also asserting their authority over the city's artistic community, decided to commission a massive fresco for the walls of the newly constructed Palazzo Vecchio. This was to be no ordinary civic decoration, but a celebration of Florentine military prowess that would rival the greatest artistic achievements of antiquity. The subject chosen for Leonardo's fresco was the Battle of Anghiari, a Florentine victory over Milanese forces in 1440 that had secured the Republic's independence and demonstrated the superiority of citizen soldiers over mercenary armies. The irony of asking Leonardo, who had spent 17 years serving Milan, to celebrate a Florentine triumph over his former patrons was not lost on anyone involved. But it also represented a kind of homecoming ritual, a public demonstration that the artist's loyalties now lay with his native city. The scale of the project was staggering. The wall designated for the fresco measured nearly 60 feet in length and 20 feet in height, creating a surface area that dwarfed anything Leonardo had previously attempted. The technical challenges were equally formidable, requiring him to develop new methods for transferring his design to the wall while maintaining the precision and subtlety that had become his artistic signature. Leonardo approached the project with characteristic thoroughness and innovation. His preparatory studies reveal an artist grappling not just with the logistics of large-scale painting, but with fundamental questions about how art could capture the reality of warfare and violence. Rather than creating a conventional celebration of military glory, he seemed determined to explore the psychological and physical trauma of combat, the moment when civilized human beings descended into animal brutality. The central scene of the composition focused on the struggle for a battle standard, with mounted warriors locked in desperate combat while their horses reared and bit at each other with almost human fury. Leonardo's studies of equine anatomy, developed during his work on the Sforza monument, now found new application as he sought to convey the terror and confusion of battle through the movements of both men and animals. But the Battle of Anghiari would also become a testament to Leonardo's ongoing struggles with the practical demands of large-scale artistic production. His experimental approach to fresco technique, designed to allow for the subtle gradations of tone and colour that his vision required, proved problematic when applied to such a vast surface. The paint began to deteriorate almost immediately, forcing him to abandon sections of the work and experiment with different approaches that might prove more durable. The frustrations of working on the Battle of Anghiari were compounded by the presence of another artistic genius who'd been commissioned to paint the opposite wall of the same chamber. Michelangelo Buonarroti, 23 years younger than Leonardo, and already recognised as a sculptor of extraordinary ability, had been assigned the task of depicting the Battle of Cassina, another Florentine military victory. The arrangement created an unprecedented artistic rivalry that captured the imagination of the entire city. The contrast between the two artists could hardly have been more dramatic. Where Leonardo was elegant, courtly, and diplomatic, Michelangelo was rough, passionate, and fiercely independent. Where Leonardo's approach to art emphasized scientific observation and technical innovation, Michelangelo relied on raw emotional power and an almost mystical understanding of human anatomy. Their different temperaments and methods represented competing visions of what Renaissance art could achieve. The competition between Leonardo and Michelangelo became one of the great spectacles of Renaissance Florence. Citizens would visit the Palazzo Vecchio to observe both artists at work, comparing their techniques and debating the relative merits of their approaches. The rivalry pushed both men to their limits, forcing them to justify their methods and demonstrate their capabilities before the most demanding audience imaginable, their fellow artists and the sophisticated citizens of Florence. For Leonardo, the pressure of this very public competition was complicated by his growing awareness that his artistic interests were diverging from the expectations of his patrons and publics. While Florence wanted him to complete the Battle of Anghiari and establish his reputation as the city's preeminent painter, his own intellectual curiosity was pulling him towards scientific investigations that seemed increasingly incompatible with the demands of artistic production. His notebooks from this period reveal a mind that was systematically exploring every aspect of the natural world with an intensity that bordered on obsession. His anatomical studies, resumed with the cooperation of Florentine physicians, were producing insights into human physiology that went far beyond anything required for artistic purposes. He was dissecting corpses not to improve his ability to paint human figures, but to understand the fundamental processes of life itself. The flying machines that filled page after page of his notebooks represented another area where Leonardo's investigations had moved beyond practical application toward pure scientific speculation. His observations of bird flight, conducted with mathematical precision and recorded with obsessive detail, were generating theoretical insights about aerodynamics and mechanical flight that would not be fully understood for another 4 centuries. These scientific pursuits were not merely intellectual exercises for Leonardo, but part of a larger philosophical project that sought to understand the fundamental principles underlying all natural phenomena. He was developing a worldview that saw connections and patterns everywhere, from the branching of trees to the flow of blood through veins, from the movement of water to the structure of mountains. Art, for him, was becoming just one means of investigating these universal principles. The tension between Leonardo's expanding scientific interests and his obligations as an artist created a crisis that would define the remainder of his career. The Battle of Anghiari remained unfinished, its deteriorating surface a visible reminder of the gap between artistic ambition and practical achievements. Michelangelo, meanwhile, had abandoned his own fresco to accept a commission for the Sistine Chapel ceiling, leaving both walls of the Palazzo Vecchio chamber incomplete. The failure to complete the Battle of Anghiari damaged Leonardo's reputation in Florence and raised questions about his reliability that would follow him for the rest of his career. Critics began to suggest that his scientific interests had compromised his artistic abilities, that his pursuit of universal knowledge had made him incapable of focusing on the specific tasks that patrons required. The image of Leonardo as a brilliant but unreliable genius, fascinating to observe but dangerous to employ, began to take shape. Yet even as his standing in Florence became increasingly precarious, Leonardo's reputation elsewhere was reaching new heights. His notebooks were circulating among scholars and intellectuals across Europe, establishing him as one of the leading natural philosophers of his age. His anatomical drawings were being copied and studied by physicians who recognized their scientific value, while his engineering designs were being examined by military experts who understood their revolutionary implications. The portrait that he painted during these Florentine years would become perhaps his most famous work, though few at the time could have predicted its eventual significance. The subject was Lisa Gherardini, the wife of a wealthy Florentine silk merchant named Francesco del Giocondo. The commission itself was relatively modest, a portrait intended for the family's private collection rather than public display. What Leonardo created, however, transcended the conventional boundaries of portrait painting to become something unprecedented in Western art. The woman who would become known to history as the Mona Lisa embodied all of Leonardo's theoretical insights about human psychology, optical science, and artistic technique. Her enigmatic expression, created through the subtle application of sfumato, seemed to change depending on the viewer's perspective and emotional state. The technical innovations visible in the Mona Lisa represented the culmination of decades of scientific investigation translated into artistic practice. Leonardo's understanding of atmospheric perspective, developed through careful observation of how distance affects the appearance of objects, allowed him to create a landscape background of unprecedented depth and realism. His knowledge of human anatomy informed every aspect of the figure's construction, from the delicate modelling of hands to the precise rendering of facial features. But the Mona Lisa was also significant for what it revealed about Leonardo's changing relationship with his patrons and his art. Unlike his earlier works, which had been created for specific religious or political purposes, this portrait seemed to exist primarily as an opportunity for Leonardo to explore his own artistic and scientific interests. He worked on it slowly and obsessively, carrying it with him as he travelled and continuing to refine details long after any reasonable patron would have considered it complete. The painting became a kind of laboratory for Leonardo's investigations into the nature of human perception and emotion. He was fascinated by the challenge of capturing not just physical appearance, but psychological depth, the inner life that animated the external form. The subtle gradations of light and shadow that played across the subject's face were designed to suggest the complexity of human consciousness itself. As Leonardo's reputation for unreliability grew, so did his value as a cultural symbol. Powerful patrons across Europe began to compete for his services, not because they expected him to complete specific projects on schedule, but because his presence at their courts would enhance their prestige and demonstrate their sophistication. He was becoming less an artist who happened to be famous, and more a celebrity whose artistic activities were secondary to his symbolic importance. This transformation in Leonardo's status created new opportunities, but also new pressures. Courts that had invited him as a painter found themselves hosting a natural philosopher whose interests ranged across every conceivable field of knowledge. His anatomical dissections, his engineering experiments, and his mathematical investigations all required resources and support that went far beyond what traditional artistic patronage provided. The French, who had observed Leonardo's genius during their occupation of Milan, were particularly eager to secure his services. King Louis XII, having consolidated his control over northern Italy, was looking for ways to demonstrate that French rule could support the same kind of cultural achievement that had made the Italian courts famous throughout Europe. Leonardo represented exactly the kind of prestigious acquisition that could validate French claims to cultural as well as political supremacy. The invitation that would eventually draw Leonardo away from Florence came from Charles d'Amboise, the French governor of Milan, and a man who understood both the practical and symbolic value of genius. D'Amboise offered not just employment, but a return to the kind of environment where Leonardo's diverse interests could flourish without the constraints imposed by republican politics or commercial considerations. By 1506, Leonardo had made his decision. Florence, the city of his birth and early training, could no longer provide the intellectual freedom and financial support that his expanding interests required. The Battle of Anghiari would remain forever unfinished, a victim of the gap between artistic ambition and practical reality. But the scientific investigations that had distracted him from its completion would prove to be his most lasting contribution to human knowledge. The return to Milan in 1506 marked the beginning of Leonardo's final phase as an artist and scientist. He was 54 years old, no longer the promising young talent who had first arrived at Ludovico Sforza's court, but a figure of international reputation whose very presence could transform the cultural landscape of wherever he chose to settle. The French court that welcomed him back to Milan was eager to benefit from his genius, but they were also preparing to discover that genius on Leonardo's scale came with complications that no patron had yet learned to manage successfully. The Milan that Leonardo returned to in 1506 bore little resemblance to the glittering court he had left 7 years earlier. The French occupation had transformed the city from an independent centre of power into a provincial capital of a foreign empire. The Castello Sforzesco, once the symbol of Milanese independence, now housed French administrators and military commanders who viewed their Italian subjects with a mixture of appreciation and suspicion. Charles d'Amboise, the French governor who had secured Leonardo's return, was a cultivated nobleman who understood the propaganda value of cultural achievement. By bringing the most famous artist in Europe back to Milan under French patronage, he was making a statement about the superiority of French civilization and the benefits that Italian cities could expect from accepting French rule. Leonardo's presence would demonstrate that the new regime could support artistic and intellectual achievement as effectively as the Sforza court had done. For Leonardo, the return to Milan offered a chance to resume the scientific investigations that had been interrupted by his departure and to work within a system that valued innovation and experimentation. The French administration, with its emphasis on military engineering and technological advancement, was particularly interested in Leonardo's mechanical inventions and his expertise in hydraulic engineering. The projects that occupied Leonardo during his second Milanese period reflected both his matured interests and the practical needs of his French patrons. He was commissioned to design a series of canals that would improve navigation and irrigation throughout Lombardy, a massive undertaking that required him to survey vast areas of countryside and develop new techniques for moving earth and controlling water flow. These hydraulic projects allowed Leonardo to combine his artistic sensibility with his engineering expertise in ways that produced both practical benefits and aesthetic satisfaction. The canals he designed were not merely functional waterways, but carefully planned landscapes that enhanced the beauty of the countryside while serving commercial and agricultural purposes. His notebooks from this period show him thinking about engineering problems with the same attention to proportion and harmony that he brought to his paintings. The anatomical studies that Leonardo pursued during these years represented the culmination of a lifelong fascination with the structure and function of living organisms. Working with physicians at the Hospital of Santa Maria delle Grazie, he was able to perform dissections on human corpses with a thoroughness and precision that had never before been attempted. His drawings of the human heart, nervous system, and reproductive organs achieved a level of accuracy that would not be surpassed for centuries. These anatomical investigations were driven by more than scientific curiosity. Leonardo was seeking to understand the fundamental principles that governed all living things, the hidden mechanisms that connected the microcosm of human physiology with the macrocosm of the natural world. His famous drawing of the Vitruvian Man, showing the human figure inscribed within a circle and square, represented his belief that human proportions reflected the mathematical principles underlying all of creation. The scientific work that Leonardo conducted during his second Milanese period established him as one of the leading natural philosophers of his age, but it also created tensions with patrons who expected more conventional forms of artistic production. The French court appreciated his engineering expertise and valued his presence as a cultural ornament, but they also wanted paintings, sculptures, and decorative works that would enhance their prestige and demonstrate their sophistication. Leonardo's response to these expectations revealed both his artistic evolution and his growing impatience with traditional patronage relationships. The few paintings he completed during these years, including a second version of the Virgin of the Rocks and his haunting depiction of St. John the Baptist, showed a deepening psychological complexity and technical refinement that surpassed even his earlier masterpieces. The St. John the Baptist, in particular, represented a new direction in Leonardo's art, one that emphasized spiritual mystery over conventional religious iconography. The saint's androgynous beauty and enigmatic gesture created an image that was simultaneously sacred and profane, challenging viewers to look beyond surface appearances toward deeper spiritual truths. The painting's dark, atmospheric background and subtle modelling of form demonstrated Leonardo's mastery of chiaroscuro, the dramatic interplay of light and shadow that would influence generations of later artists. But even as Leonardo was creating these final masterpieces, his attention was increasingly focused on theoretical investigations that had little immediate application to artistic practice. His studies of optics, acoustics, and mechanics were generating insights that would not be fully appreciated until the scientific revolution of the 17th century. He was developing theories about the nature of light, the behavior of fluids, and the principles of mechanical advantage that placed him centuries ahead of his contemporaries. The notebooks that Leonardo filled during his second Milanese period reveal a mind that was systematically working toward a unified theory of natural phenomena. He saw connections everywhere, from the spiraling patterns of water flow to the branching structures of trees and blood vessels. His investigations were guided by the belief that the same mathematical principles governed all natural processes, from the smallest organic functions to the largest cosmic movements. This holistic approach to knowledge made Leonardo increasingly isolated from his contemporaries, who were accustomed to more specialized forms of expertise. While other artists focused on perfecting their craft within established traditions, and other scientists concentrated on particular fields of investigation, Leonardo was pursuing a kind of universal knowledge that seemed to belong to an earlier age of philosophical speculation. The isolation was intellectual as well as social. Leonardo's habit of writing in mirror script and his use of coded symbols made his notebooks difficult for others to read, while his tendency to leave projects unfinished created a reputation for unreliability that limited his opportunities for collaboration. He was becoming a solitary genius, admired from a distance but difficult to work with on practical projects. The political situation in Italy during the early 16th century also contributed to Leonardo's sense of displacement and uncertainty. The French occupation of Milan was constantly threatened by shifting alliances and military campaigns that could change the balance of power overnight. The Papal States, the Holy Roman Empire, and various Italian city-states were all maneuvering for advantage, creating an environment of perpetual instability that made long-term planning difficult. In 1512, these political tensions finally erupted into open warfare that would once again disrupt Leonardo's life and career. A coalition of papal and Spanish forces, supported by Swiss mercenaries, launched a campaign to drive the French out of northern Italy. The Battle of Ravenna in April 1512 resulted in a French victory, but at such enormous cost that it actually weakened their position and encouraged their enemies to continue the fight. As the military situation deteriorated, French control over Milan became increasingly precarious. Charles d'Amboise, Leonardo's patron and protector, died in 1511, leaving the artist without a reliable advocate within the French administration. The new French commanders were more focused on immediate military needs than on cultural achievements, and they had little patience for the kind of long-term scientific investigations that absorbed most of Leonardo's attention. The end came suddenly in the summer of 1512, when French forces were finally driven out of Milan by the combined armies of their enemies. For the second time in his career, Leonardo found himself fleeing from a collapsing political order, forced to abandon projects and seek refuge elsewhere. At 60 years old, he was too experienced to be surprised by such reversals, but too set in his ways to adapt easily to new circumstances. The Milan that Leonardo left behind in 1512 was a city that had been transformed by 2 decades of foreign occupation and warfare. The cultural achievements of the Sforza period had been largely destroyed or dispersed, and the French attempt to recreate that golden age had ultimately failed. Leonardo's own contributions to the city's intellectual life, from his engineering projects to his scientific investigations, would be largely forgotten until scholars began to rediscover his notebooks centuries later. As Leonardo travelled south from Milan for what would prove to be the final time, he carried with him the accumulated knowledge and experience of 6 decades devoted to understanding the natural world. His notebooks contained insights into anatomy, engineering, optics and mechanics that would not be equalled for generations, while his paintings represented a level of artistic achievement that had redefined what was possible in visual art. But he was also carrying the burden of unfulfilled ambitions and incomplete projects that had marked his entire career. The great bronze horse remained a pile of clay fragments. The Battle of Anghiari was deteriorating on the wall of the Palazzo Vecchio, and countless scientific investigations had been interrupted by the practical demands of survival in an unstable world. The gap between Leonardo's vision and his achievement had grown wider rather than narrower, as his reputation and responsibilities had increased. The road ahead would lead through the Papal States toward Rome, where a new pope with humanist sympathies was creating opportunities for artists and scholars who could contribute to the spiritual and cultural renewal of the Catholic Church. Pope Julius II had already demonstrated his commitment to artistic excellence by commissioning Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling and Raphael to decorate the papal apartments. There might be room in this new artistic renaissance for the aging genius whose reputation still commanded respect throughout Europe. But Leonardo would discover that Rome, for all its artistic opportunities and intellectual resources, presented challenges that were different from but no less difficult than those he'd faced in Milan and Florence. The papal court operated according to its own complex rules and priorities, and the competition for papal favour was intense among some of the most talented artists and intellectuals of the age. Success in Rome would require not just genius, but the kind of political sophistication and personal diplomacy that Leonardo had never fully mastered. Rome in 1513 was a city intoxicated by its own magnificence. Under Pope Julius II and his successor, Leo X, the Eternal City had become the epicenter of a cultural revolution that sought to rival the glories of ancient Rome. The papal court attracted the greatest artists, architects, and intellectuals of the age, all competing for commissions that would immortalize their names alongside the Caesars and saints. Into this atmosphere of ambition and creativity came Leonardo da Vinci, now 61 years old and carrying the weight of a lifetime's accumulated wisdom and disappointment. The Rome that welcomed Leonardo bore little resemblance to the medieval city of pilgrims and monks. Pope Leo X, born Giovanni de' Medici, had transformed the Vatican into a Renaissance palace where classical learning flourished alongside Christian devotion. The Pope himself was a man of sophisticated tastes and expensive habits, who famously declared upon his election that God had given him the papacy to enjoy. His court was a glittering spectacle of wealth and learning, where cardinals competed to display their erudition and artists vied for the honour of contributing to projects that would glorify both the church and the Medici name. For Leonardo, this environment offered both tremendous opportunities and new forms of frustration. His reputation preceded him to Rome, where he was received as a living legend whose very presence enhanced the prestige of the papal court. Pope Leo X, who had known Leonardo during the artist's earlier stay in Florence, was eager to add such a prestigious figure to his circle of cultural advisors and artistic collaborators. The living quarters provided for Leonardo in the Vatican's Belvedere Palace reflected his elevated status. He was given spacious rooms with northern exposure, perfect for painting, along with workshops where he could pursue his scientific investigations. The papal library, one of the finest in Europe, was placed at his disposal, giving him access to ancient texts and contemporary scholarship that had been unavailable elsewhere. For a man of Leonardo's intellectual appetite, these resources represented an unprecedented opportunity to synthesize his lifetime of observations with the accumulated wisdom of centuries. Yet the Roman environment also presented challenges that tested Leonardo's aging patience and adaptability. The papal court was dominated by younger artists whose energy and ambition reminded everyone of Leonardo's own advancing years. Michelangelo, now 38 and at the height of his powers, had recently completed the Sistine Chapel ceiling and was working on designs for Pope Julius II's tomb. Raphael, still in his 20s but already recognized as a master, was decorating the papal apartments with frescoes that combined classical grace with Christian symbolism. The presence of these artistic giants created an atmosphere of intense competition that was both stimulating and exhausting for Leonardo. While his reputation commanded respect, his age and his history of unfinished projects made some patrons hesitant to entrust him with major commissions. The swift execution and reliable completion that characterized the work of his younger competitors stood in stark contrast to Leonardo's reputation for perfectionist delays and scientific digressions. The commission that Pope Leo X eventually offered Leonardo reflected both respect for his genius and awareness of his limitations. Rather than a major public work that would require years of sustained effort, the Pope requested a series of smaller projects that would showcase Leonardo's diverse talents, while minimizing the risk of embarrassing delays. These included mechanical devices for papal entertainments, engineering consultations for Vatican construction projects, and scientific investigations that might enhance the Church's reputation for learning and sophistication. Leonardo approached these assignments with characteristic thoroughness, but his notebooks from the Roman period reveal a mind increasingly absorbed by theoretical questions that had little practical application. His studies of optics led him to investigate the nature of vision itself, producing theories about how the eye processes information that would not be confirmed until the development of modern neuroscience. His mechanical investigations explored principles of energy conservation and transformation that anticipated discoveries that would not be formalized until the Industrial Revolution. The anatomical work that Leonardo pursued in Rome represented perhaps the most advanced scientific research of his entire career. Working with physicians at the Papal Hospital, he was able to perform dissections with unprecedented systematic precision, creating detailed drawings of internal organs that revealed their structure and function with remarkable accuracy. His studies of the human heart, in particular, demonstrated an understanding of cardiac function that would not be equaled until the 17th century. These anatomical investigations were not merely scientific exercises for Leonardo, but part of a larger philosophical project that sought to understand the relationship between body and soul, matter and spirit. He was fascinated by the question of how physical processes could generate consciousness and emotion, how the material substance of the brain could produce the immaterial phenomena of thought and feeling. His drawings from this period show him mapping the nervous system with the precision of a modern neurologist, while simultaneously exploring questions that belonged more to philosophy than to medicine. The mechanical inventions that filled Leonardo's Roman notebooks were equally remarkable for their theoretical sophistication and practical impossibility. He designed flying machines that incorporated insights from his decades of studying bird flight, but which required materials and power sources that would not be available for centuries. His concepts for automated manufacturing equipment anticipated industrial techniques that would not be developed until the modern era, while his studies of friction and mechanical advantage laid groundwork for principles that would later become fundamental to engineering science. The gap between Leonardo's theoretical insights and the technological limitations of his age became increasingly apparent during his Roman years. He could envision solutions to problems that would not be solved for centuries, but he lacked the materials, tools, and manufacturing techniques necessary to implement his ideas. This frustration with the constraints of his historical moment contributed to a growing sense of isolation and melancholy that marked his final years. The artistic works that Leonardo completed during his Roman period reflected this tension between vision and possibility. His painting of St. John the Baptist, completed around 1515, showed a figure that seemed to emerge from darkness through subtle gradations of light and shadow that pushed the boundaries of what paint could achieve on canvas. The saint's enigmatic expression and ambiguous gesture created an image that was both religious and deeply personal, a meditation on faith, doubt, and the mysteries of human consciousness. The technical innovations visible in this late work represented the culmination of Leonardo's lifelong investigation into the physics of light and the psychology of perception. Every brushstroke was informed by decades of scientific observation, from his studies of atmospheric perspective to his analysis of how facial muscles create expressions. The painting functioned simultaneously as a work of art and as a scientific demonstration, proving that careful observation of natural phenomena could produce aesthetic effects that transcended conventional artistic categories. But even as Leonardo was creating these final masterpieces, his relationship with the papal court was becoming increasingly strained. The younger artists who dominated Roman cultural life operated according to different principles and priorities than those that had shaped Leonardo's career. Where he valued investigation and experimentation, they emphasized productivity and completion. Where he sought to understand universal principles, they focused on specific projects and immediate results. The clash of artistic generations became particularly evident in Leonardo's interactions with Michelangelo, whose temperament and methods represented everything that Leonardo found troubling about contemporary artistic practice. Michelangelo worked with passionate intensity, completing major projects through sustained effort and unwavering focus. His approach to art emphasized emotional power over intellectual refinement, spiritual inspiration over scientific analysis. The two masters represented competing visions of what Renaissance art could achieve, and their rivalry became one of the defining cultural conflicts of the age. Leonardo's notebooks from his Roman years reveal growing frustration with the constraints and expectations of traditional artistic patronage. At 63, he was being asked to compete with men half his age in a cultural environment that valued speed and spectacle over the careful investigation and theoretical sophistication that had always driven his work. The gap between his reputation and his current productivity became increasingly difficult to ignore, both for himself and for potential patrons. The scientific investigations that had always been Leonardo's true passion were also becoming more difficult to pursue within the papal court. While Pope Leo X genuinely appreciated learning and innovation, the practical demands of governing the church left little time or resources for the kind of open-ended research that Leonardo required. The anatomical work that fascinated him was also viewed with some suspicion by conservative elements within the Vatican, who worried that such detailed study of human corpses might lead to materialist conclusions that contradicted Christian doctrine about the soul's immortality. These tensions came to a head in 1516 when Pope Leo X's attention was diverted by the growing crisis of the Protestant Reformation. The challenge posed by Martin Luther's theological criticisms required the Church to focus its resources on defending orthodox doctrine rather than supporting speculative investigations that might raise uncomfortable questions about the relationship between faith and reason. The cultural renaissance that had flourished under papal patronage was beginning to give way to a more defensive posture that left little room for the kind of intellectual freedom that Leonardo required. The invitation that would provide Leonardo with his final refuge came from an unexpected source. Francis I, the young king of France who had recently ascended to the throne, was eager to demonstrate his cultural sophistication and to attract prestigious figures who could enhance the glory of the French court. Having heard of Leonardo's genius from French nobles who had encountered him during their Italian campaigns, Francis offered the aging master a position that seemed almost too good to be true. The terms of the French king's offer were extraordinarily generous. Leonardo would be given a comfortable residence near the royal palace at Amboise, along with a generous pension that would free him from financial worries for the remainder of his life. He would have no specific obligations beyond serving as the king's advisor on artistic and scientific matters, and he would be free to pursue whatever investigations interested him. For a man who had spent his entire career balancing his intellectual curiosity against the practical demands of patronage, this arrangement represented the perfect synthesis of security and freedom. The decision to accept Francis I's invitation was not difficult for Leonardo to make. Rome, for all its artistic opportunities and intellectual resources, had become an environment where his age and his methods were increasingly seen as obstacles rather than assets. The French court offered not just material comfort, but the respect and appreciation that he had always sought from his patrons. At 64, Leonardo was ready to leave behind the competitive pressures of Italian cultural life for the more relaxed atmosphere of a court that valued him for what he had already achieved, rather than demanding constant proof of his continued productivity. The journey from Rome to France in the autumn of 1516 marks the beginning of Leonardo's final chapter, a period that would see him recognized not just as a great artist, but as a symbol of human intellectual achievement itself. The notebooks and paintings that he carried with him represented the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime devoted to understanding the natural world, while the royal patronage that awaited him in France would provide the security and respect that had too often been lacking in his earlier career. The Loire Valley that welcomed Leonardo was a landscape of gentle beauty that seemed perfectly suited to the contemplative mood of his final years. The Château du Clos-Lucé, which King Francis provided as his residence, was a comfortable manor house surrounded by gardens where he could walk and think without the pressures and distractions that had marked his urban career. For the first time in decades, Leonardo found himself in an environment where his intellectual curiosity was valued for its own sake rather than being seen as an impediment to more practical concerns. The relationship that developed between Leonardo and Francis I was unlike any that the artist had experienced with previous patrons. The young king, still in his early 20s, approached the aging master with a mixture of reverence and genuine intellectual curiosity that created an atmosphere of mutual respect and affection. Francis was not simply collecting a prestigious ornament for his court, but seeking to learn from one of the greatest minds of the age. And Leonardo responded to this sincere interest with a warmth and openness that had been rare in his earlier relationships with patrons. As Leonardo settled into his French retirement, he carried with him not just the physical artifacts of his career, but the accumulated weight of a lifetime's unanswered questions and unfulfilled ambitions. The great bronze horse that had consumed years of his energy in Milan existed now only in drawings and memories. The Battle of Anghiari that had challenged his abilities in Florence remained unfinished and deteriorating. Countless scientific investigations had been interrupted by practical necessities, leaving theories half-developed and experiments incomplete. Yet as he arranged his notebooks and paintings in his new home, Leonardo could also survey achievements that had already secured his place in history. The scientific observations recorded in his mirror script had advanced human understanding in ways that would not be fully appreciated for centuries. The artistic techniques he had developed had revolutionized painting and established new standards for what visual art could achieve. The engineering concepts he had explored had anticipated technological developments that would transform human civilization. The final years at Clos-Lucé would provide Leonardo with the peace and security necessary to reflect on this extraordinary lifetime of achievement while continuing to pursue the questions that had always driven his restless intelligence. In the gardens of the Loire Valley, surrounded by the respect and affection of a royal court that valued genius for its own sake, the aging master would find at last the perfect balance between intellectual freedom and material security that had eluded him throughout his remarkable career. The final 3 years of Leonardo's life unfolded with the serenity that had been absent from his earlier decades of constant movement and uncertainty. At the Château du Clos-Lucé, he established routines that reflected both his advancing age and his enduring intellectual curiosity. His mornings were typically spent in the gardens, where he would walk slowly among the carefully tended paths, observing the play of light through leaves and the patterns of growth that had fascinated him since childhood in the hills of Tuscany. These daily walks were not merely exercise for an aging body, but continuation of the scientific observation that had defined his approach to understanding the world. Even in his final years, Leonardo filled pages with sketches of plant structures, noting how different species adapted to their environment and how mathematical principles governed their growth patterns. His notebooks from this period reveal a mind that remained as sharp and inquisitive as ever, still seeking to decode the fundamental laws that connected all natural phenomena. The relationship with King Francis I deepened into something approaching genuine friendship, a remarkable development for a man who had often found himself isolated by his own genius. The young monarch would visit Clos-Lucé regularly, not as a patron checking on his investment, but as an eager student seeking to understand the world through Leonardo's extraordinary perspective. Their conversations ranged across every conceivable subject, from the mechanics of human anatomy to the design of ideal cities, from the behavior of water to the movements of celestial bodies. Francis was particularly fascinated by Leonardo's engineering concepts, many of which seemed to anticipate technological possibilities that lay far in the future. The aging master would demonstrate mechanical principles using simple models constructed in his workshop, showing how gear ratios could multiply force and how properly designed channels could control the flow of water with mathematical precision. These informal lessons represented a unique form of education, as one of history's greatest minds shared his accumulated wisdom with a ruler who possessed both the intelligence to understand and the power to potentially implement such innovations. The artistic work that Leonardo produced during these final years was limited but profound. His right hand, weakened by what modern medical experts believe may have been a stroke, could no longer execute the precise brushwork that had characterized his earlier masterpieces. Yet his left hand remained capable, and he adapted his technique to work within these new constraints, creating drawings and paintings that possessed a different kind of power than his earlier works. The self-portraits from this period show a face marked by age and experience, with flowing hair and penetrating eyes that seem to look beyond the physical world toward deeper truths. These images were not exercises in vanity, but careful studies of how time transforms human features while leaving the essential character of a person intact. Leonardo was documenting his own aging process with the same scientific detachment he had brought to his anatomical investigations, creating a visual record of mortality that was both personal and universal. The notebooks that he continued to fill during these years reveal a mind grappling with increasingly philosophical questions about the nature of existence and human consciousness. His earlier investigations had been driven by practical curiosity about how things worked, but his final writings show him pondering why anything existed at all. What purpose might underlie the elaborate mechanisms he had spent a lifetime studying? These meditations on the meaning of life and death gave his final scientific observations a poetic quality that distinguished them from his earlier, more technical writings. On May 2nd, 1519, in the quiet chambers of Clos Lucé, Leonardo da Vinci drew his final breath. The hands that had painted the Mona Lisa's enigmatic smile, that had sketched flying machines centuries before their time, that had dissected human hearts to understand the very essence of life itself, finally came to rest. King Francis I, who had rushed to be at his mentor's bedside, would later claim that Leonardo died in his arms, a fitting end for a relationship that had transcended the usual boundaries between patron and artist to become something approaching true understanding between kindred spirits. The death of Leonardo marked more than the passing of a single, extraordinary individual. With him died the Renaissance ideal of the universal genius, the belief that one mind could encompass all human knowledge and push the boundaries of every field simultaneously. The world was becoming too complex, too specialized for such comprehensive mastery ever to be achieved again. Leonardo was perhaps the last human being who could legitimately claim expertise in art, science, engineering, anatomy, architecture, music, and philosophy without anyone questioning his credentials in any of these domains. Yet in another sense, Leonardo's death was not an ending, but a beginning. The notebooks he left behind, filled with mirror writing and revolutionary insights, would inspire generations of thinkers and creators who followed. His artistic techniques would influence painters for centuries, while his scientific observations would be rediscovered and validated by researchers working with instruments he could never have imagined. The flying machines that seemed like fantasies in 1519 would take to the skies 4 centuries later, designed according to principles he had first articulated through careful observation of birds in flight. Leonardo's greatest gift to humanity may not have been any single painting or invention, but rather his demonstration that the human mind, properly applied, has no limits.